What would you do if you were a skilled worker in India not making much money, and then you read an ad for jobs in the United States offering good money and a green card? What the ad did not tell them is their American dream would quickly become a nightmare, and then a movement. Hi, it's Paul from HEC Books, where we talk with authors about great stories and great writing. If you're new to our channel, please make sure to click the subscribe button. Now, let's hear from author Saket Soni, whose first-hand account of how those men broke free is called The Great Escape. Saket Soni, welcome to St. Louis. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
The book is terrific, and we'll get to the story in a minute. But first, I want to get to your story, which is just fascinating in and of itself. You immigrated to the United States from India, college age, to study theater. Which I suppose is somebody's probably done that before from India, but that's
not that
usually,
I know of.
That's not usually what they come to study. But then what's really interesting is you made it from theater into labor organizing. How did that happen?
Yeah, well, I wasn't planning to. My parents are probably the only parents in India who ever let their son go to the United States to study theater. I ran a theater company after I graduated, and then I missed an immigration deadline. I didn't think it was very serious. I didn't relate to it as a crisis. My life went on. It was about as difficult to deal with as an unreturned library book. But then 9/11 happened, and I lost my foothold in normal American life. Like many, many immigrants, I worked in the service industry for a while. I worked as an undocumented person in kitchens. I met a lot of other undocumented people and a lot of other refugees, people seeking political asylum. And that experience turned me from theater to community organizing.
I remember there used to be a television commercial that ran here late at night and for a vocational school. And there was an 800 number on the screen, and the announcer said, "Could a phone call change your life? This one quite possibly could." Well, you got one of those calls and heard some things you hadn't really heard before that kind of changed the direction of your life and certainly led to the creation of this story. Tell us what that phone call was all about.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I came from Chicago to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I arrived to volunteer for 10 days, and I ended up staying 16 years. And early in my time, in 2006, just months after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, months after the flooding, I was running a small nonprofit organization protecting the workers who were rebuilding New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. You know, Katrina and its flooding turned the Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site. The repairs were massive. These are, post-war proportion rebuilding efforts that were going on. 1 million homes had to be rebuilt in Louisiana, 1 million more in Mississippi. And the people doing the rebuilding were all migrant workers, mostly immigrants, many of them from other states, many of them from other countries. And early in the morning, they would stand under this 60-foot-tall statue of Robert E. Lee. They'd gather looking for work, and contractors would arrive in buses. We'd climb onto the buses and go out to dark, distant corners of the Gulf Coast. So as a labor organizer, I was tasked with solving people's problems. That's what you do when you're a labor organizer. There was one night I was solving a pretty thorny problem. I was helping a young Honduran day laborer ransom his kidnapped nephew when I got a mysterious phone call. This midnight caller.
On your birthday?
On my birthday. In fact, I sent my parents to voicemail. Not a good thing to do, but I had to because I was in the middle of the stakeout. And then I realized that the next caller was from India. And I wondered, what on earth is an Indian man doing, newly arrived in the, deep in the 228 area code where Katrina made landfall? It turned out this Indian man was one of 500 Indian workers who had arrived into labor camps in Mississippi and Texas, working for an oil rig builder in a situation, a level of exploitation that a federal jury later called human trafficking and forced labor.
They were brought to this country I mean, they came of their own volition, I suppose, but certainly under false pretenses. They had to
Yeah.
pay a fortune, first of all, to get here, which wasn't legal.
Well, recruiters for this oil rig builder went to India. They placed ads, talked to hundreds of workers, and they promised them an American dream. They promised them green cards and good jobs, and they promised that in 9 months they would be joined with their families and begin an American life. Now, this was extraordinary. For these workers, it was the holy grail, right? The catch was they'd have to pay $20,000. Now, that's a lot of money in India. That's generations of savings. Workers sold their ancestral land. They put homes on the hock. They took high-interest loans, 17, 18% interest loans from violent money lenders, and they arrived. And it turned out that they were dropped into an American nightmare. There was no American dream. There were no green cards. The workers were working round-the-clock shifts in barbed wire fenced labor camps. They were living 24 to a room in trailers in a labor camp that was located on company property. They were surveilled by guards. They were eating frozen rice to sustain themselves. And they were paying $1,000 a month for the privilege of living in this labor camp.
It's outrageous.
It is. It is. It truly is. And to think that this is 2006, 2007, this is 21st century America.
Now, is exploitation on that level common with migrants, or was this sort of an extraordinary, an outlier?
Well, it was the furthest example of the rule. It wasn't an outlier in the sense that migrant workers across the United States, in farms and in poultry factories, in the manufacturing industry, migrant workers from all over the world arrive and face abuse. But this particular scheme was uniquely lucrative for the company benefiting from it and the recruiters who brought the workers. That was exceptional. These are 500 workers who had been charged $20,000 apiece by this fascinating trio of recruiters. The recruiters made millions, and the company got the most skilled workers in the world, welders and pipe fitters, at a fraction of the cost of U.S. workers, all to help the company make good on incredibly lucrative contracts, beat their competition, and it all helped this company march towards a day when it would go public in the market. It really boggles the mind. At the center of the scheme was this liberal New Orleans attorney who considered himself the immigrant's best friend. He was an idealist. He was actually, when he was a young kid, he was introduced to refugees because his parents brought in a pair of Cuban teenagers who had been rescued through their church. So this young man, he was, barely 8 years old, he literally looked up to these two Cuban teenage refugees who taught him to play baseball and they would have these dinner time conversations in Spanish and English. And this attorney told me in an interview how he carried these refugees with him a long time. They turned him into an immigration attorney who wanted to help strivers arrive and make it in the United States. But then Hurricane Katrina happened, and I think that really pushed him into a financial and family crisis, and he used his immigration powers to sell this scheme to this company.
Were the recruiters at all responsible for the conditions in the camp, or was that the company? I mean, did the company say, oh, we didn't realize it was that bad?
Well, the recruiters were responsible for selling the scheme to the workers, bringing the workers in. But the recruiters had a pre-existing deal with the company. Now, the company claimed it never knew that the workers were being charged $20,000 at first. But then workers arrived, and workers told camp managers, workers told whoever would listen, that they needed their green cards and they needed to pay off these debts. So at that point, the company knew, but the company kept bringing successive waves of these workers. The company constructed this labor camp so that the workers, in paying rent, would make the company another $5 to $7 million. So they were all connected in this scheme. No one was absolved from this.
Now, the workers, I suppose, technically could come and go from this barbed wire camp, but not really, because they had to have handlers to take them in and out. But I suppose if it was that bad, people might say, why didn't they just leave?
Yeah, and absolutely, many of them tossed and turned in their bunk beds at night, wanting to leave. The conditions were atrocious. The affronts to dignity were daily. The food was awful. And most importantly, the green cards were nowhere in sight. So the workers were just, not sure who to trust. They didn't know what to do. But they couldn't leave, not because they were locked in by lock and key, but because of the debts. They had taken on extraordinary debts to pay the $20,000. They had done that on the promise of green cards. The company continued to promise green cards. They continued to string the workers along, saying, just hold on, your green cards are coming, we'll apply. So that kept the workers in the labor camps and working for the company, even past the point where their visas expired, even past the point where they became undocumented. They stayed in the labor camp, not able to go anywhere. That's the definition of human trafficking and forced labor, that you're not free to leave. And a federal jury came out afterwards and said that, yes, even though the workers were theoretically able to physically leave the camp on their 2 feet, they couldn't have left because of the debts and the threats.
Until they did.
Until they did. And that's the great escape at the center of the book. And I don't want to give anything away, but
it's a caper.
It's a caper. The Great Escape was engineered partly by me, but in partnership with this extraordinary man I met. He was just one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met. And the bond I had with him was one of the great friendships of my lifetime. He called me secretly, invited me to meet him, and then over a series of clandestine meetings, taught me about the situation the workers were in, the conditions at the camp, the dynamics of the company, but also he taught me how to cook. And I smuggled him all sorts of Indian ingredients and spices. He commandeered the cafeteria and cooked these extraordinary Indian meals for these men to wake them up out of a catatonic state. And he told them, look, there's another way. And then we engineered the Great Escape, which, without giving it away, it involved a lot of flavored cigars, the kind you find at Mississippi gas stations. Maybe you find them here as well. It took a lot of wild turkey whiskey, little mini bottles of wild turkey bourbon.
These were bribes for the guards.
For the guards, yeah. And we created an elaborate pretext, a fictitious but incredibly elaborate Indian wedding, which formed the pretext to ferry 500 men out from under the noses of guards and into the hotel from where they made their great escape.
An Indian wedding for a woman who was actually already married.
Yes, and the hotel owner, who was close to company officials, popped in at some point at night and talked to me and noted that for a wedding, there was an extraordinary absence of things associated with weddings, such as music, women, children, family, food, and joy of any kind. All there was 500 men afraid. And I said, yeah, it's a serious wedding. It's that kind of wedding. So he left, and then we made our escape.
Well, we won't spoil any more of that except to say that the escape did happen.
It did.
And then, curiously, the next morning, they all went back.
Yes. This was a show of defiance. The men, for the time they were trapped inside the company, had grown extraordinarily afraid of company officials. And it took an enormous amount of courage for them to come out. Once they were out, though, they wanted to send a clear message that they were no longer working for the company, that they were, they were now away from the company's control. So they marched back to the company gates. It was a clear day. They were wearing their hard hats. The sky was reflecting in their yellow and red hard hats. And 500 men marched to the company gates in the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. They removed their hard hats and threw their hard hats in the sky towards the company gates in a show of freedom. They cried freedom, and then they set about marching.
And then they had to hide.
Yeah, we had to hide 500 men until the Department of Justice arrived. So we had filed a criminal complaint alleging human trafficking to the Department of Justice. The strategy was that if we triggered a DOJ complaint, the Department of Justice would then send an investigator. Usually this is at first a law enforcement official. We assumed it would be the FBI. And the FBI did call, and we imagined that within days, if not hours, an enforcement official would be there. Well, days went by, and we hid the men in a hotel that was still broken up, still torn up after Hurricane Katrina. It was the only place I could afford to hide 500 men on a small nonprofit budget. But days went by, and no Department of Justice official came. The FBI called, but then radio silence. So we needed to decide what to do, and that's when I proposed to the men that from time to time, when people have needed justice in this country, they've marched, and that these men too should march. So we set off on a long march, a 14-day-long march from New Orleans to Washington, D.C., to the doorstep of the Department of Justice.
As a labor organizer, you're used to bringing pressure to bear on companies when they're treating their people poorly. Why go to the extreme of the escape? Why not do something like just a strike?
Yeah, the strike was actually something the workers were ready to do. I had a secret meeting with Rajan, my first ever meeting with him, and he said, look, let's go on strike. And he laid out for me the company's production calendar. And it was like watching someone throw a dart right at the center of the dartboard. He knew, he had honed in on the specific production week during which if we went on strike, the company would come to its knees. The problem is that, in labor organizing, you strike for things a company can give you. And these men needed green cards. They needed legal status in the United States. They needed to be made whole, not just in terms of money. They needed the promises to be kept that were made in India of legal status, the ability to work and stay in the United States and bring their families. And that's just not in the power of a company. No company that grants a worker a temporary visa is in the position of promising that that visa will turn into a green card, no matter how much the company wants. So that's why we went to the Department of Justice. These workers were victims of trafficking, and they no longer needed anything from the company. They now needed to bring their case to the DOJ, and the DOJ could grant them all of the things they were asking for.
And to bring attention to it, then they marched from, this was Pascagoula, Mississippi, where the oil rig company was, all the way up to Washington, D.C., which I looked up. It's about 1,200 miles.
It's a long stretch of highway through Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. It's not easy to traverse. You have to, if you want to take hundreds of people on a march up to Washington from anywhere in the South, you have to be willing to walk 10 hours a day through long stretches of highway that have no sidewalk. These men were pelted with bottles by passengers and jeering passengers in cars. There were trucks that opened their windows and people pelted bottles down from high on top. But it never really broke their resolve. They were afraid, but each attack just kept making them stronger. So you have to understand, these people came from India. And as people born in India coming to the U.S., they had more faith in American institutions than most Americans. And they would say to me, it's right there in the name. Because they would call it the Department for Justice. And they'd say, well, all we have to do is get there. And then we get justice. It's right there in the name. What we didn't know was that deep inside the federal government, there were corrupt agents, corrupt law enforcement agents with their own corrupt ties to the company, who were at work while we slept, dismantling our campaign and working against the Department of Justice investigation.
And they were just in the periphery. This was the ICE investigator, Immigration and
Right
Customs
at the center of the
Enforcement.
investigation. Yeah, that's right.
Completely working against you, completely unknown to you.
Unknown to me, unknown to the men, and astonishingly unknown even to the high-up Department of Justice officials who were at the helm of the investigation.
You were talking about these being Indian men. I'm wondering if that contributed at all to the idea of going on a hunger strike, which happened at one point, given the history of Gandhi in India, because it seems like people don't really go on hunger strikes anymore, but your group did.
Yeah. Hunger strikes are deep in the memory of how India won independence. Mahatma Gandhi carried out 17 hunger strikes in his life, and the first one he ever carried out was actually to resolve a labor dispute. There were people in a textile factory who were on strike, and Mahatma Gandhi's first hunger strike helped those workers get the company to the table and negotiate an agreement. So, Mahatma Gandhi called it a kind of moral action, the last resort of a moral fighter. And for our own moral fighters, for our own battalion of men, they knew the risks involved. They knew it would be physically very trying, but they were in this situation in Washington where even their friends in D.C., members of Congress, congressional staffers who were initially with us were starting to shake a little. What we didn't know then was that this ICE agent and others inside the immigration department were at work really whittling away at our trafficking complaint, whittling away at our allegations of human trafficking. And these men needed to be seen as moral actors. They were being sort of treated in Washington as one more special interest group come to lobby. Well, they weren't. They were trafficked people from India, escaped a labor camp and walked to Washington. But suddenly they just needed to do something more. And so they reached into their own memory and came up with this and decided, well, we're going to do a hunger strike. The hunger strike eventually lasted 24 days and won over an extraordinary number of congressional supporters.
Well, there was one holdout who kept going.
There's one holdout who kept going. Yeah, he. I don't know how he did it, but according to him, the reason his body could withstand it was because there were 100 nuns in a church he went to in his hometown in Kerala. In a 1,000-year-old church by the sea, 100 nuns were praying for him. This is what he told me. He was a Roman Catholic. And that power of prayer just made him keep going. Finally, I put it to him that this tactic has done everything it could. We've got these incredible congressional supporters now. It's time to come off your hunger strike. What I couldn't tell him at the time was that there was a far greater danger that our hunger strike couldn't even begin to confront, which was that it was now, clear to me that immigration police agents were trying to arrest, incarcerate, and deport the men. And so I had to convince these men to go into hiding. I didn't need to explain all that. This extraordinary hunger striker came off his hunger strike. Men went into hiding, and the next few years they spent as fugitives.
Well, and that sort of brings up an interesting point that I imagine people who haven't read the book are probably asking themselves is if their temporary visas had expired, they left the shelter, so to speak, of the man camp on this long, very public march. Why weren't they just deported? Because they were undocumented. They had no reason to be here legally at that point, right?
Well, they almost were deported. If the immigration agents working against them had their way, the men would have been deported. But understand the reason they would have been deported, which was to execute an extraordinary cover-up for the central crime that was at stake. You can't have in the 21st century companies, and not just small mom and shop companies that are unlicensed, fly by night, one van and two lawnmowers. We're not talking about that kind of company. We're talking about a major private equity owned oil rig builder, which is enormously profitable for its executives, for the shareholders of the private equity firm that owns it. I mean, enormously profitable company, right? We can't have companies like that bringing in workers from other companies, from other countries, trafficking in workers, enslaving them, subjecting them to human trafficking and forced labor as a way of getting ahead. I mean, what honest company could do business if this is a fine way to make a profit? You just can't reward these bad actors. And that was why it was incredibly important for the workers to stay in the U.S., and bring this company to justice. That's what they eventually did. Beyond that, these are also victims of trafficking. I mean, we have laws in this country that allow workers who have been trafficked to the U.S. to stay for the course of the investigation and then get humanitarian visas if they choose to stay past that. They've given up because of false promises or fraud or coercion. They've given up their foothold in Indian life or wherever they come from. They're now here, and they spent a time building up the United States. They took the courageous step of coming forward to report this crime at great risk to themselves. And so they deserve to belong in the United States. And that's something eventually the U.S. government agreed to and happily granted them visas.
Just out of curiosity, once they all walked off the job and this oil rig company had all these oil rigs that they were making millions of dollars building, what did they do to get people to continue to do the work? Surely they didn't go back to India and bring more people over.
Yeah, they had a very bad day. A very bad
Just
day.
one?
They had a series of very bad days. Yeah, they were right in the middle of production for extraordinarily, high-value customers. They couldn't deliver, right? Then their reputation sank and sank. Eventually, after a federal jury found them responsible for having trafficked these workers and subjecting them to forced labor, the company basically, sold off its assets, declared bankruptcy. The same company, the same people in that company reconstituted under a new name. So they weren't quite brought to justice, but I like to think that many, many companies around, across the Gulf Coast got the message that this is not how you can do business in America.
Well, beyond approaching the government, then there was a civil suit as well. And we'll just leave it there so that people have a good reason to read the book and find out what the ending is. But beyond that, I guess the epilogue would be that, with more and more natural disasters, presumably as a result of climate change, more and more of these companies are going to be bringing in migrant workers to do this kind of work. That's what your organization does, is police this now. Are there any better protections in place now? Because this was only 15 years ago when this all started.
This was recent, yeah. And since Katrina, disasters have become more frequent and more destructive. Katrina was supposed to have been a once-in-a-100-year flood. And since then, there have been over $200 billion disasters. And what we found is those same workers like these, who rebuilt the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, have been rebuilding year after year in different places. What I didn't know when I met these workers, that they were the first of a growing and now permanent workforce that exists in the United States that we call resilience workers. These are people who rebuild homes and schools and cities. They follow hurricanes, floods, and fires. When disasters come, workers follow disasters. And I and my team follow the workers. We're with an organization called Resilience Force. And our mission is to protect the workers, but also help them complete what they started, complete the repairs, of American cities so that people can come home. It's a growing industry in the age of climate change. And yes, conditions are improving because we've got, firstly, partners in government now. We have the most extraordinary Department of Labor in many generations. We've got a group of leaders among the workers, people who've been in this workforce now over a dozen years, people who've rebuilt after a dozen or more hurricanes. And so they've become sort of leaders of the workforce. And then, happily, there are good companies that are coming forward and saying, look, we need these workers. We need to do right by them so that they stay in the industry, so that we can get these contracts and complete the work.
By way of wrapping up, I want to end sort of where we began with you studying theater. I'm wondering if any of that came into play during any of this, if some of your background is, producing theater to motivate people, to make people think, had anything to do with, having marches and hunger strikes and even writing the book.
Yeah, well, theater came in handy. And I really learned through theater that you have to be telling a story. That's much more important than making a point. If you tell a good story and you tell it scenically, people come on stage and they have opposing, desires and intentions, and they fight it out and they move a story forward. Then you've got an audience. Then you've got people, who want to stay with you. And that was really important during the campaign. That was a David versus Goliath story, if there ever was one. Workers born in penury in India, some of whom worked $1 a day, arriving in the United States up against a leader in the oil rig business, a leader in the oil industry. And that's a David versus Goliath story. I had the good fortune then of being able to tell that story all over again in a much deeper way in this book. And yeah, theater came in handy again. The other thing that came in handy was my friend Rajan and the lessons he gave me in cooking. All those cooking lessons helped the campaign, but they also helped the book. There's a lot of food in the book that kind of enlivens the book, and I hope that's another reason to read.
Well, maybe if they turn it into a movie someday, you could direct it. It would make a great movie.
We'll see. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Heard it here first.
Thank you.
The book is absolutely marvelous, and what you're doing for labor in this country and
Thank
for
you. I
migrant
so appreciate
laborers is tremendous.
Thank
the
you.
book is The Great Escape. Saket Soni, thanks so much for being with us.
So appreciate being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for joining us today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for new content.